Com.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Situation Room. As always, I'm your host of Tactics, Caleb Colquitt, and thank you so much for being with us here this evening, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. So we're going to have to very much adhere to those maxims this evening, because this is going to be what is somewhat of a touchy topic, but I do think that it's important that we get into it. So I want to give you a little bit of background on this episode and the reason that I decided to do it, even though I'm not really doing a regular show most of the time now. Now, for those of you who have not been keeping up with me much on the Tactics Facebook page and my other social media feeds, what's been going on recently is because I've been in grad school, I haven't had time to do regular shows the way that I have in the past, but I have been doing one this week because I'm actually going to be starting up classes back in the spring. I got a little bit of a lull between classes, and so I decided to go ahead and do an episode here because I did think that this was a timely and important topic. I saw this really weird thing start to crop up amongst Protestants, and I don't really live in Protestant world, and I don't, most of my friends are not Protestants, and so because of that, I kind of live on the outer rim of that, and I hadn't come across this issue. So what happened is, of course, in October 7th, a couple months ago, when the war broke out in Israel, I saw a very bizarre phenomenon amongst people, both online and in person, where there were certain groups of Christians in the Protestant, sort of in Protestantism, that were very much in favor of supporting Israel and America supporting Israel and voicing personal support for Israel. And then I saw an interesting dynamic where there were several that seemed dead set against it with a sort of religious fervor. And it wasn't until I came across a friend of mine who I spoke to that actually is a Protestant that kind of explained that divide to me. So apparently there's two different theological camps which have largely decided where these two groups of Christians decide to land on the Israel issue. And so normally, especially here in the recent past where I've not been doing regular daily shows, I kind of take the stance of, when it came to foreign policy, even back when I was doing my show every single day, I never really dove super deep into foreign policy, not because I didn't think it was important or because it was a topic that didn't interest me. It was primarily because I understood that there are big national hosts that have far better connections than I do, that can actually afford to have people on the ground and talking to people that are in those other nations. And so because of that, I kind of thought, guy with a show from Alabama doesn't really have those connections. And so I focused primarily on local stories. And you remember that local news was always sort of the top priority when we were talking about things here in Alabama. But the reason that I decided to do an episode on this issue specifically is because while that may not necessarily be something I can offer a specific insight on, with the exception, of course, of Ukraine, because I've been to Ukraine multiple times, this story kind of jumped out at me because since there is a theological aspect to it, it sort of winds up directly in my wheelhouse. And for those of you who don't know, the reason that I haven't been doing episodes recently is because I'm currently pursuing a master's. I just completed one master's in biblical studies. I'll be going for a second one in biblical theology, and then I go on to get my doctorate. So because this is kind of in my wheelhouse, I felt like I might have some insights that other talk show hosts or other conservatives might not necessarily have. So there you go. That's why we're having an episode here. And by the way, just so you know, even though we haven't had an episode in quite some time, the annual Tactics Festivus episode is coming up, and that will be happening next week with guest host Laura Clark, and my own dad is going to be here, John Colquitt. So that'll be a really fun time, and I've already done the planning stages for that one, laid the groundwork. That one should be airing sometime next week, or we might actually even wait till the actual day of Festivus, December 23rd, to air it. But we'll keep you in the know about that. Let's go on to the actual topic at hand and what we're going to be talking about today. So I didn't realize this again until my buddy, who is a Protestant, sort of explained this conflict to me. And so I did a little bit more research after talking to him. Apparently, many of the American Christians, because of course Protestantism is sort of the mainline Christian denomination, there's a lot of Catholics too, and some non-denominationals like myself, but a lot of people in America that profess to call themselves Christians fall into the theological camp of Protestants, and that apparently is divided into two camps when it comes to things like eschatology. Now, for those of you that, you know, are not massive nerds like me that spend all your time reading stuff like this, for the person that actually has a life, eschatology is sort of the end time study. So anything relating to end times, for example, wrote a term paper on eschatology, and it was about how our bodies will be in the resurrection, or what we'll be able to do if we'll have free agency and free will in the afterlife. So that's part of eschatology as well. But specifically, eschatology, with what they're talking about with this topic, deals with end times and end times prophecies. And so these two camps within the Protestant movement really kind of fall into one of the other, for the most part, at least based on the research that I've done. And those two camps are dispensationalism and what is known as replacement theology. So replacement theology deals with a broader scope than just eschatology. Dispensationalists tend to focus a little bit more on the end times prophecies, but in both of these camps, they have their own reasons for either supporting or not supporting Israel. And I'm going to get into the details about that here. And we'll do that by sort of dissecting each one and pointing out what they believe. So, by the way, remember, I'm not really in this world. So if you are a listener and you're a Protestant, you happen to fall into one of these two camps and I say something incorrect, feel free to comment. Feel free to say something or say, okay, well, yes, you're right, but that doesn't necessarily have context, or you got that one wrong. Feel free to do that. I don't mind criticism here. Again, as I said at the top of the hour, disagreement isn't hate. So remember that. So here we go. Dispensationalism, as I understand it, and based on my research, is that essentially physical Israel. So, and I'm not even talking about Israel as it exists, even though they think that that's incorporated in that. I'm not talking about the modern state of Israel that's in the conflict right now. I'm talking about physical Israel. In other words, the Jewish people and them existing as a nation is going to be restored before Judgment Day. And again, without going into too many details, essentially this has to do with, they believe that the prophecies of Revelation do deal specifically with Israel, and that modern Israel being reestablished in the wake of World War II is actually part of the fulfillment of that prophecy, and that at some point what is going to happen is that Jesus is going to come down, he is going to reign in Israel, the physical state of Israel as it exists right now, and is going to do so for 1,000 years. Now, there is some disagreement on exactly what that looks like. There is a little bit of disagreement amongst dispensationalists about, what specific events in Revelation are going to happen before or after that reign. But the big umbrella that kind of gathers them all together is they believe that Israel is God's people. They continue to be God's people until this day. And eventually, Jesus is going to come down, this time, as opposed to the last time when Jesus came to Israel and they rejected his rule. They're going to then accept his rule this time, and they are going to declare Jesus their king. Israel will be reestablished as a world power, and Jesus is going to reign over all the earth from a throne on David's throne in Israel, and that's going to happen for 1,000 years before the Judgment Day. So again, that's the short version of it. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the best summary that I can muster here. Israel is going to be restored, and the temple is also going to be rebuilt according to them, and Christ will return to rule there. Basically, this is why they support Israel. I'm not saying that it's the only reason they support Israel, but one of the reasons that they have an extra incentive to support Israel is they believe that Israel existing in that physical space on the land that is historic Israel is actually a part of the fulfillment of the prophecies of the book of Revelation, and that is actually God's plan to prepare the way for his son to come again and reign in Israel before the judgment comes. So they actually support Israel because they see them as God's chosen people, and that to do anything that tries to stop that or gum up the works or whatever it is actually something that would be working against God's will. Therefore, they support Israel in their conflict and their ability to stay there on the land. Now, they also hold that the church is essentially God's backup plan. So again, this is just me reading the literature from them. They believe that the church was actually never something that God initially intended, that what really happened is that God was planning on Jesus coming down, and he was going to be delivered into Jerusalem, and that he was going to become king and he was going to reign there. Unfortunately, the Jews decided to reject him, and because he rejected them, Jesus then established a kingdom, a not physical kingdom, and not of physical Jews. Basically, the church was his plan B. His initial idea was going to be to reign in Jerusalem from the very beginning, but since they rejected him and they refused to allow him to be seated on the throne of David, that what happened is that God decided, okay, well, we'll go with this contingency plan and we'll establish the church to sort of keep the tradition and the theology of Jesus alive until the point the Jews are ready to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior and their King. So that's kind of where they come for that. And then they also believe that when the Jews do accept Jesus, that will be the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. So you may remember this covenant is established in Genesis 15 and sort of reestablished or restated multiple times throughout Genesis, and also referenced several times throughout the Torah and the rest of the Old Testament. So the prophecy specifically states that the world will be blessed, the entire world, the entire human race will be blessed through the seed of Abraham, and that he is going to father a mighty nation, the number of which is greater than the stars in the heaven or the grains of sand on the beach. Like it will be a blessing for all of mankind, and that is going to come through Jesus. And so they believe that once he actually is established on his physical throne in Jerusalem, that will be the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. So that's kind of where they stand on that one. And then there is the second camp, which is known as replacement theology. So replacement theology is also very heavily rooted in their eschatological beliefs. So it does deal very heavily with the end times. They just believe that the way that that is going to unfold is slightly different than the people that are dispensationalist. So the replacement theology camp believe that the prophecies are about the church, which has replaced Israel. So like when you're reading, for example, through the book of Revelation, and you get to the part that's very near the end where God's people triumph and the signs start becoming that of a new heaven and a new earth, and a new Israel is established, and you see a lot of like creation theology woven into that, where there is a new Eden, where it's very reminiscent of the Garden of Eden, and God is basically restoring his plan. And so every time where it talks about that and there being a new Israel, what God is actually saying is the new Israel is the church. And so the people of Israel, as they stand today, the Jews have no special place in God's heart. They are equal with everybody else. They essentially believe that the Jews did serve their purpose, but they've been replaced by the church, and therefore there's no more need for them. Physical Israel doesn't have any real significance or importance anymore. God may use it as a staging ground, but the actual people of Israel and the people living in Jerusalem, they've been replaced by the church. And so it is the church, every time that these prophecies are brought up, that God is talking about when he refers to his people or the people of God, that's referring to the church that Jesus Christ established. That was his plan. That was always his plan. They're not like the dispensationalists who believe that the church was essentially a contingency plan. They believe that the establishment of the church was God's plan from the very beginning. And because of that, the Israelites basically served their purpose. They were able to create the Messiah. And once Jesus Christ was here and he died on the cross, Israel was done away with. The old law was done away with, and it was replaced by the new Israel, which of course is the kingdom of God, the church, however you want to say it. That is the replacement theology. And this is also sometimes referred to as historic millennialism. So essentially, they also believe in the 1,000-year reign. They believe that that millennium is going to take place. It's just they believe that the kingdom that God is going to rule over is not Israel, but instead it is the people who have accepted him and become members of his church, and therefore that's what historic millennialism is that whether or not he actually rules in Jerusalem is kind of a point of contention for them as well. There's not a, not everybody agrees as to whether or not he's going to rule in the area that we know as Jerusalem. I don't know that that's a big debate or not, but the point is, in their theology, it doesn't necessarily have to be in Jerusalem because the Jews are no longer the chosen people of God. But either way, Jesus is going to rule over his church in this millennium, and he's going to rule a physical kingdom on earth. It'll just be his church instead of the Jews. Also, they believe that most of the New Testament references to Israel are actually about the new Israel. So even when you get Paul talking in his epistles and things that are not necessarily the eschatological prophecies, what they're actually addressing is the church itself. So when they talk about the Jews or they talk about Israel, they read that as the new Israel. So when they believe that when a lot of those writers are talking about Israel, what they're actually saying is the church. They're just using a different name for the church when they do so because the church has replaced Israel in that sense. So that's kind of where they stand on that one. And they believe that the death of Jesus is the fulfillment to Abraham's covenant with the Old Testament prophecy. So you remember we were talking about that covenant a second ago, that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. Well, they believe that. They just believe that it already happened. So it was a prophecy. It's just that that prophecy was already fulfilled. And so now we're living in the fulfillment of that, which is the kingdom of God. So in other words, when Jesus dies on the cross, his blood is spilled. People have atonement for their sins and now can be forgiven of their sins, and they have communion with God, are able to live. And then when they die, they're able to ascend to heaven. That is the blessing that the Abrahamic covenant was discussing, in their opinion. So those are kind of the basics of both of those camps. And you can kind of see why one camp or the other camp might have a vested interest in this particular conflict, because their theological presuppositions would kind of mandate that. So what you have is a lot of dispensationalists, of course, want to support Israel because they believe that Israel being there in that physical space is a fulfillment of God's prophecy and God's will. And the replacement theologists believe that, okay, the people of Israel, they're not God's people. Modern Israel is a completely different group of people. There's no real significance to that anymore. And so because of that, them being there, and I didn't really understand this again until I spoke to my buddy about this and did a little bit more research on it. One of the reasons that there's some animosity towards the modern state of Israel by people that hold to replacement theology primarily revolves around the idea that they're fake Jews, that they're not real Jews, and all these wars and conflicts that are happening, they're kind of unnecessary because the truth is God no longer cares whether the Jews occupy the physical land of Israel now anymore. And so because of that, they just kind of see it as though, well, this is a big waste of time. There's no reason for us to support them because God doesn't really care whether they live on that land anymore or not. That's something that is completely insignificant. And so because of that, a lot of them tend to, even if they don't like full on support the people that are opposing them, they tend to basically take a hands off, we don't care and we should have no interest in helping them or not. They're not real Jews anyway, and so whatever. So that's kind of the stance. And again, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. I'm sure that there's some people that don't feel that way, but that's the reason that you're seeing this divide, is because there's at least a significant plurality of the people in both of these camps that hold to that because of their theological disposition. So in my attempt to become the most unpopular man on the internet, I think both of them are wrong. And maybe with the way that I set that up and said that this was a fight that I never heard of and had never like really done any research on, you probably predicted that. But the truth is, I think they're both wrong. I think neither one of them are theologically correct. And so I'm going to get into my reasoning for that, and then I'm going to deal with the real world application to that. But I'll just go ahead and give you the biblical stance for why that is the case. So I think the dispensationalists are wildly misreading apocalyptic literature, because the whole point of apocalyptic literature, and for those of you who don't know, that's the sort of the moon turning to blood and the stars falling from the heavens and all that stuff. If you understand that genre, you understand that none of it is supposed to be taken literally. The author never intended for it to be taken literally, whether you're talking about Revelation, whether you're talking about Ezekiel, whether you're talking about Hosea, whether you're talking about any of the Old Testament prophets or Revelation. that genre of literature uses extremely vivid and flowery imagery to convey an actual truth, but the image itself is not the point. It's sort of like when people depict Jesus as a lion. Is he literally a lion? Or are they just using the lion as a symbol of his power, his ferocity, his nobility? They're pointing to the symbol to communicate an actual truth about the person himself. And so you're seeing the very same thing happen in a lot of apocalyptic literature. Again, I could do, 3 or 4 hours of lectures just on apocalyptic literature. I'm not going to do that because that's not why you're here. But that seems to me to be the origin of all the misconceptions and incorrect lines of thinking across this particular theological camp, is that primarily they run into that problem because they incorrectly read the literature as though it's supposed to be taken literally. So, for example, and again, you can argue with me in the comment section if you want to. I'm sure that there's going to be an abundance of disagreement on this, but they, for example, would take the stance that when there is a man surrounded by 7 stars in the book of Revelation, that means that Jesus is going to literally be surrounded by 7 stars at some point in the events of Revelation, that he's literally going to hold the 7 stars in his hand. I don't believe that. I don't believe that the angels are literally going to pour bowls of wrath out. I don't believe any of those things are quite literally going to happen. I think that that is a figure of something, but I don't think that it's going to happen literally in that way. And part of the reason for that is because there are several prophecies of the Old Testament that use exactly the same kind of language. For example, you have in the Old Testament prophecies the foretelling of the destruction of Babylon, the foretelling of the destruction of Edom, and it uses exactly the same language. In the prophecy about Edom, for example, it talks about the mountains being melted and the stars falling from their perch in the heavens. Okay, well, the mountain of Edom didn't literally melt down, and the stars in heaven didn't literally fall from the sky, but Edom's been destroyed for like 2,300 years at this point, so that prophecy was very obviously fulfilled a very, very long time ago. Yet none of that stuff happened. Why? Well, it wasn't supposed to be saying that that was literally going to happen. It was going to say that's what it's going to feel like to the Edomites, because their world is going to come crashing down and their civilization will be wiped from history. And that's exactly what happened. It just happened in the figurative sense, not in the literal sense, because that prophecy couldn't possibly be fulfilled today because those people no longer exist anymore. And so that's just one example. Again, I don't want to get way off into the weeds there, but that's the reason why, if you actually understand the genre of apocalyptic literature, you understand it's not supposed to be taken literally. But anyway, a lot of the dispensationalist theology they'll point to, and I've had countless people that fall on the dispensational side of this camp point this out to me, that a big rallying cry for them is the 11th chapter of Romans. So I felt, to be fair to them, I do want to go through that passage and actually read through it and see what it says, and then talk about whether or not that's something that we should be following or if it means what they say that it does. So we're going to take a brief tour through Romans chapter 11, and we'll see if what they're claiming about the Jews continuing to be God's chosen people is indeed what the author Paul is saying there in Romans 11. So we're going to go ahead and start at the beginning, and we will jump around a little bit, but we are actually going to start at verse 1. So you can see there in Romans 11, 1 through 5. I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. But what is the divine response to him? I have not kept it for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In the same way, then, there has also come to be at present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. So what is key here is that passage where it talks about the remnant. And if you tend to be on the dispensational side, you say, well, that's it, case closed. There's a remnant of Israel that is still there and is still righteous and that God still holds to. There's a bit of a problem with that understanding of the scripture, though. Because, I mean, yeah, the layman might look at that and say, well, I mean, that pretty clearly proves that dispensational theology is right. However, if you understand the context of that verse that he's talking about, and he tells you right there in the verse that he's actually referencing a story about Elijah. And so that remnant that he's discussing is the 7,000 people in Israel that have not yet bowed a knee to Baal. And so even in the story that he's referencing, he is talking about people that are theologically aligned with God, not people that are aligned with God because of their blood tie to Abraham. That's simply not the case. Any other reading of that scripture would be incorrect, because if you know the story of Elijah and what he was going through, that's in the aftermath of Mount Carmel. And most of Israel had turned to worshiping Baal. You'll notice that God does not justify the people that are worshiping Baal there. Now, was Israel still the covenant people at the time of Elijah? Absolutely. There is no question about that whatsoever. And yet the remnant, the faithful remnant that he is talking about, are not the people that hold Abraham's blood in their veins. The faithful remnant, the 7,000 people that have refused to bow a knee to an idol called Baal, are the people that are theologically loyal to God, not the ones that have a share in God's promise because they happen to be related to Abraham. And so trying to read that passage as though that means, oh, well, that what that's saying is that if God's going to fulfill his promises, then he's going to be faithful to all those who are related to Abraham and physical Israel. I'm sorry, but that's a stretch. Even if you're going back to Elijah's time, it would be difficult to make that case based on that particular passage by itself. And remember that all the Baal worshipers, they were Jews too, and God was not happy with them and basically leaves them enough rope to hang themselves. Now, he still brings them back after a time, because, you know, if you know that story, you know that eventually God does, after the exile, bring them back, whether they were loyal to him spiritually or not. And problems continue to ensue because Jews are humans just like the rest of us. But my point in all of that is trying to read that as though, oh, well, the Jews must really still be God's people. That's a massive leap not even Evel Knievel could make. So let's go ahead and look at the next passage that I want us to take a look at here real quickly. And it also comes from Romans 11, and it is verses 28 through 29. So we'll go ahead and read that, Romans 11, 28 through 29. From the standpoint of the Gospels, they referring to the Jews here, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Oh, okay. Well, that means that God's prophecies, his blessings, his callings, his promises are irrevocable, which means that the promise that he made to Abraham and to the people that he would preserve them, that he would always protect the Jewish people, well, those are not those are irrevocable, which means that, well, I guess that says that dispensational theology is correct. Again, you need the context to really understand what that passage is talking about. And this is why I know we don't have time to read the entire book of Romans here, but I do have to give a little bit of context on the book of Romans as a whole. Romans was a mixed church. It was, because it was such a large city and because there were so many different kinds of people living in it, you see from the book of Romans and the epistle that Paul writes there, he's dealing with several different people at the same time, because he's appealing to the Jews, he's appealing to the Gentiles, he's appealing to several different theological groups and people with different backgrounds within those two groups. And so the reason that Romans is so long and because it's so comprehensive is because he's having to deal with a lot of different people and all the problems that they're having at the church in Rome. It's also important to note that Claudius Nero actually ejected all of the Jews and they were dispersed out of Rome. They were no longer allowed within the city. And that happened in AD 41 through AD 53-ish, we think. And that you can actually see the biblical evidence of that. That happens in Acts 18, verse 2. And at this point, the Jews were the primary enemy of the church. Because you have to keep in mind, even though there is some persecution that is going on from Roman officials and from Greek officials, we see, points of that in Ephesus. most of the Greek and Roman world at this point didn't care about Christians. They didn't see them as a threat. They didn't see them as a nuisance. They weren't really persecuting them. They sometimes did get annoyed when you like cut into their bottom line. For example, when the silversmiths over there that are making statues of Dionysus and Artemis, and people are no longer buying it because there's people converting to Christianity and not wanting to buy their idols anymore, they get kind of hot under the collar about that. But barring a few episodes of that, the vast majority of the persecution that was coming from Christians at the time, it wasn't coming from Romans or Greeks. That happens a little bit later. It does happen, but it happens later in history. And so Romans has to be written before about 60 to 65 AD because we know that's when Paul dies. So if that's the case, Romans is probably being written in the mid-50s. And so this is before widespread Christian persecution was happening by the Romans or the Greeks. And so the reason that we see in that verse that Paul is talking about the Jews saying that they are enemies is because the primary rival, the primary source of antagonism from people outside of the church at the time were Jews. And so that's why it's so important to understand this. When Paul is saying these things to the Romans, he is not addressing this as though, well, you have to understand the Jews are still God's special people, and because of that, you have to acknowledge them or give them some kind of special status in that way. That's not what he's saying at all. He's saying, I get that the Jews disagree with you and they're antagonizing you, but remember, I'm a Jew, and you have Jewish brothers and sisters that are just coming back into the church, that are just being reintegrated into the church after this exile. And because of that, you shouldn't hold out any extra contempt for the Jews. See, it's actually the exact reverse. If you're reading it in modern times, you could kind of see, well, oh, I guess what he's saying there is that we need to give Jews special status. Yes, but you're thinking about that from the standpoint not of the original audience, but of somebody that's living after we've had 2,000 years to reconcile with the Jews, and the Jews and the Christians don't really bother each other much anymore. Back then, the Jews were the number one antagonist of the church, including Paul, by the way, before his conversion. And so because of that, it's important to note what Paul is actually saying there is, look, I know that the Jews are persecuting us, but you can't just have a prejudice against Jews and think that, you know, because they're Jews, then we can just treat them however they want because they treat us however they want. He's appealing to them to remember that the Jews were God's chosen people and that he is also a Benjamite. And because of that, the promise extends to them as well. And so this is a really important point, that the promises that were given in the Abrahamic covenant, they extend to the Jews as well. He's saying just because they're Jews doesn't mean you shouldn't be evangelizing to them. Just because they're Jews doesn't mean they can't share in the blessings that Jesus promised when he came here and died on the cross to resolve the issue between man and God and forgive your sins. They have access to that blessing just like you do. That's what Paul is actually saying in that passage. Let's go to Romans 11, verses 15 through 21. Romans 11, 15 through 21. For if their rejection, again, they talking about the Jews, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. But if some of those branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and became a partaker with them in the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that that is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right. They were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. So that to me is a fairly conclusive rebuttal of what is known as dispensational theology, primarily because you see there that it's talking about the branches being broken off. Well, if all Jews are God's people and that was his original plan, who the heck are the branches that are broken off? That doesn't make any sense. What he's saying is there are a lot of Jews that rejected Jesus. That is true. And he actually says to them, quite right, you are right to point that out, that those branches were broken off and you could be grafted in. But if that's the case, then the people that are broken off and the people that are still there, the natural branches that are there, he's saying you're not allowed to hold them in special contempt. They're the natural branches, and you had, natural branches that snapped off, and you now are part of the thing. He says, yes, but remember that the root is supporting both of you, whether you're a natural or a grafted in branch. The grafted in branch, of course, being the Gentiles like myself. So what's the root? Well, the root's pretty obvious. The root is Jesus, the promises of God which were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so because of that, what you're looking at there is not the idea that the Jews were always God's real chosen people and that the church was just the sort of the stopgap that he had to put in. What he's talking about in Romans 11 is the Jews that were faithful and accepted Jesus as the Messiah. They are the ones that are sharing in this blessing, just like the Gentiles. So the idea that the Jews have some sort of special status because of Romans 11, if you actually read the chapter and understand the context that's going on in Romans, you understand that's not what it's talking about at all. In fact, I would say that Romans 11 is probably the single biggest piece of evidence in the opposite direction. That it's very clear based on the wording of the chapter that what it's talking about is the Jews that were faithful and actually partook of the promises that were promised when Abraham was given that covenant. They partook in the fulfillment of that and now worship Jesus. So that's what's going on here when he's talking about the promises being fulfilled. He's talking about the Jews that remained faithful to him by accepting his son, the Messiah. He's saying they don't have special status. You don't have special status. There are some people that want to brag about being natural branches. Yeah, well, natural branches were broken off to fulfill that promise. But the natural branches that are still there, they're feeding off the same root you are. So don't pretend like you're any better than the natural branches just because you were grafted in. As long as you are connected to Christ, and that's really Paul's point, as long as you are connected to Christ, that's the only thing that really matters. So ultimately, that is how God deals with people, is that as long as they are connected to and they share in the blessing of his son, then he's fine with them whether they're Jew or Gentile. So with that being said, let's look at one more passage here in Romans 11. This one actually comes from Romans 11, verses 30 through 32. For just as you were once disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may be now shown mercy. For God has shut up all in disobedience, so that he may show mercy to all. So right there, that's kind of the clincher. He shows mercy to all, because all people need mercy. The Jews need mercy. The Gentiles need mercy. They all needed mercy. Some people accept that mercy. Some people reject it. That includes Jew. That includes Gentile. The only thing that matters to God now, according to Romans 11, is do you have a connection to Jesus Christ? Are you connected to his death, burial, and resurrection the way that Romans 6 prescribes, the way that you have obedience to the gospel, the way people have always had a relationship with God is through faith and obedience. And the book of Romans says that over and over and over and over again. So ultimately, that's really what's going on here. The Jews and Gentiles are no longer special classes because Jesus got rid of that distinction between people. There's neither Jew nor Greek. God is no longer a respecter of persons. All have the opportunity to partake in the blessings that were given to us by Jesus Christ. So with that being said, let's go ahead and look at Colossians 3, 9 through 11. Do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices, and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him, a renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free man, but Christ is all and in all. Pretty conclusive right there. It very clearly says the only thing that matters now is your relationship with Christ. You put off your old self, whether your old self is a Jew, a Gentile, a pagan, whether you're a former Pharisee or a former temple prostitute at the temple of Aphrodite, doesn't matter. Your old self is put off. You have put on the new self. You wear the garment of Christ. You wear him like a garment, and when God looks at you, he doesn't see your sin, he sees you. He sees Jesus Christ, and you wearing Jesus Christ because you have put him on through the death, burial, and resurrection. So ultimately, whether you're Jew, Greek, barbarian, none of that matters anymore. The only thing that matters is, are you a Christian or are you not a Christian? And so again, this is the reason that I think dispensationalism falls pretty short of the actual Bible narrative, because there are no second class citizens in the kingdom. All are equal because all are under the same king. And the Jews have not been abandoned, which is what the replacement theology people try to preach. They've not been abandoned. It's not that they don't matter to God anymore. It's that they have the same status before him as every human being does. They no longer have a special status above that of others. The only thing that God cares about in the latter days after Jesus Christ has died is, do you have a relationship with Jesus Christ? Have you actually been saved? Have you gone through the process? Have you believed? Have you heard? Have you repented of your sins? Have you confessed him before men? Have you been buried with him in baptism and been raised up in his death in newness of life, just like he was resurrected? Those are the things that God cares about now. And so this is why I say that the dispensationalist and the replacement theologist are actually both wrong, because ultimately it's not whether or not the Jews were replaced or not, or whether or not the Jews are still God's people or not. What matters is that Jesus was the fulfillment of both of those things. So you might be sitting here and say, well, Caleb, what about all the prophecies of Israel's return that happened in the Old Testament? I ran into this with someone who was a dispensationalist not too long ago. And so his argument was, well, there's all these prophecies in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel, in Jeremiah, about Israel returning. Yes, and they did. And I'm not talking about the modern state of Israel. If you understand the Old Testament and you know your Bible history and know your timeline, you know that Israel did go away for a while. They were exiled by the Assyrians and then later on by the Babylonians. So the northern kingdom fell to Assyria. The southern kingdom of Judea, which is the one that we're more familiar with, that was exiled to Babylon. They were exiled about 200 years apart. And then they came back in the case of the southern kingdom 70 years later. They were returned. And so all those prophecies of Israel returning to their homeland, yeah, that happened already. That happened about 400 years before Jesus Christ came. And so because of that, those prophecies do exist. I don't pretend that they don't. It's just that they already were fulfilled. And so the idea that the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of the prophecies of God, there's just really no biblical evidence for that. Those prophecies already happened. So there you have it. Now, there are parallels, to be sure, but the new kingdom is very different than the old one. And this is kind of where the replacement theology starts to come in. So it ultimately comes down to, Jesus did not abandon the Jews and he did not replace the old law. He fulfilled his promise to both. Let's go ahead and look at the chapter. Let's see. This is from the Sermon on the Mount. So we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 18. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. So there you have Jesus promising that, no, he didn't come here to replace the old law. He didn't come here to abolish the old law. He came to fulfill it. This was always God's plan. He always intended for the church to be the ultimate fulfillment of his promises. Israel is extremely important. The reason that I study the Old Testament so vociferously is because I believe that. But they are important because it sets up the New Testament, not because it's something that we're supposed to adhere to today. And so this is where I think a lot of the replacement theologists start to get it wrong. See, think about the old law as scaffolding. Is scaffolding a bad thing? Well, no, you need scaffolding to be able to build a building. If the building's going to be more than about a story tall, you kind of need the scaffolding to be able to work on the outside of it. But once the building's there, what do you do to the scaffolding? You take it down. It's not because it was bad scaffolding. In fact, it served its purpose. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. It created a way for the thing that was actually supposed to be built was there. I mean, if you just put up the scaffolding and didn't actually build the building and said, oh, well, you've got a building there. No, you don't. That's scaffolding. Not the same thing. But if you were to build the building, but you kept the scaffolding up there, not only would it serve no purpose, but it actually kind of get in the way of you using the building that you spent so much time on the scaffolding building. And so that's really what the old law is. It was a structure that fit and did exactly what God designed it to do, and it fulfilled its purpose. And once its purpose was fulfilled, in this particular case, the bringing forth of the Messiah, you take the scaffolding down because you don't need it there anymore. And actually having it up would hinder the use of the thing that it was created to do. And so the scaffolding fulfilled its purpose. That doesn't mean you take it away. It doesn't mean that there's not lessons you can't learn from the Old Testament. Paul refers to it as a tutor, so sort of a thing that can help teach us important lessons, but it's not something that we're bound to anymore. And that's one of the things that the scripture is quick to point out. Let's actually go ahead and look at a couple more passages about this. This is from Hebrews chapter 8, verses 7 through 10. For if that first covenant, talking about the old law here, had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. For finding fault with them, he says, behold, days are coming, says the Lord, when I will effect a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, and I did not care for them, says the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds, and I will write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now, for those of you that may not have caught that, that is a specific reference back to Jeremiah 31 through 33. So here we have an actual apostle. Well, I say that. I believe that Hebrews is written by Paul. There's people that will argue with me on that, but I'm convinced that it was written by Paul or somebody at least close enough connected to Paul that it bears his authority in the same way that Luke or Timothy, well, actually he wrote Timothy, that Luke or one of the other non-apostolic authors of the New Testament did. It has the touch of apostolic authority, as we call it in scholarly circles. So the book of Hebrews, inspired word of God, straight up says, yes, these prophecies of Israel's return do exist, and they happened, and their ultimate fulfillment was not in the returning from Israel. Their ultimate fulfillment was in Jesus Christ. And that's what we see in Hebrews 8, that the old covenant is no longer needed because the new covenant came not to abolish the old, but to fulfill it. And so this is where I think both camps actually fall a little bit short. And you may actually recall, if you're looking back in the verses that we already looked at, this actually syncs up quite nicely with Romans 11, verse 29, where it says, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. So again, it's not that it's not as though those promises went away. It's that they were fulfilled. They reached their ultimate fulfillment in exactly what God wanted them to be fulfilled with. And so that's where we find ourselves. Oops, actually wound up with the wrong page there. There we go. So anyway, that's really where we find ourselves. And I kind of think of it, this is something that helped me understand it. When you're looking at covenants, one of the more common covenants that you'll see talked about throughout the scripture is the marriage covenant. So you have covenants with God, but then you also have a God-sanctioned covenant in marriage where you have two people that make a covenant with one another. So here's my question. If a widow were to remarry, her husband died, she was faithful to her husband, he was faithful to her, but they died, and she remarries, is she being unfaithful to him? Of course not. Why? Because she didn't break her covenant, she fulfilled it. The terms of the covenant were that she would be faithful to her husband until death. Well, death happened. And because death is now parting them, they're no longer bound by that covenant because that covenant is now over. It's not that anybody did anything wrong. It's not that she's breaking the covenant or replacing the covenant. It's that that covenant was fulfilled at the moment that he died. And now, if she wants to, she is free to make a new covenant with somebody else. And so the same thing is going on in terms of the Old Testament. It's not that the Old Testament was flawed or messed up or any of those things, but God saw that it was going to be insufficient to save mankind. And because of that, it served its purpose to set up the covenant that would save mankind. And so once that covenant was fulfilled, you were no longer bound by it, so that God could make a new covenant with man through his son, Jesus Christ. That's ultimately what was trying to go. And so it's not as though God's promises, like we saw in Romans 11:29, were revoked. It's that Jesus and the church was God's promise. That covenant was always established so that Jesus could come and fulfill God's promise through Abraham. So let's go ahead and talk about the political implications of that, because we've kind of gone pretty thoroughly through the theology. So let's actually talk about the politics and what the reaction should be to this. So to those of you who might fall into the dispensationalist camp, look, God's judgment is going to come regardless of what you do. Now, I've gone through an awful lot to say that I don't think dispensational theology is correct here, and I've pointed all of those things to you. But even if you are dispensational, you say, well, Caleb, I think you're wrong. Well, you're free to do that. It's a free country. But even if you do take that stance on it, even if you do genuinely believe that, what God wants to happen is going to happen regardless of whether you support Israel or not. That's just the way that it is. And if you have faith that God's will is ultimately going to be accomplished, do you really think that you flying an Israel flag or supporting Israel is going to help that along? No. I mean, that's a silly belief to have. For all you know, the modern state of Israel could be completely destroyed, and then God could establish them again 1,000 years later. I don't know. My point is, nothing you do politically is going to change God's plan for the end times. He's already got that plan in place. Jesus already affirmed in Matthew 24 that a time has already been set. Nothing you do is going to hasten or slow that down. And so because of that, you're wasting your time if your reason for supporting Israel didn't say you're wrong to support Israel. I want to be clear on that. I'm just saying if your reason for supporting Israel is, well, my theology informs me that this is how the end time is going to happen and I have to support Israel because I want the end time to come forth, that's a silly notion. Whether you support Israel or not is not going to affect whether or not Judgment Day happens. Judgment Day is going to happen. God's like Gandalf. It is going to happen at exactly precisely when he means it to. It's going to happen at exactly that time, and nothing you do is going to have any effect on that whatsoever. For my friends in the replacement theology, you know what? Your support of Israel or, not supporting Israel is similarly pointless. And here's why. I understand that some of you that hold to replacement theology have legitimate reasons for being skeptical of what's going on with the war effort, especially after some of the shenanigans that have happened with Ukraine. And remember, I support Ukraine. I have loved ones in Ukraine. But at the same time, there's been an awful lot of shenanigans and money changing hands and using Ukraine and all this aid we're sending them as a money laundering scheme where politicians vote for more funding for Ukraine and then somehow money from Ukrainian oligarchs winds up in their bank account. Like, I 100% agree with you that that's going on, and you are right to be skeptical if that's the reason you're like, I don't know if we need to be sending financial aid to Israel as Americans. Okay, legitimate discussion. We can have that discussion, and I'm fine with having that discussion. That is a totally reasonable position to take. However, if your reason for not supporting Israel in this is because, oh, well, they're not really Jews. Oh, well, they're not really God's people. Oh, well, the church has replaced Israel as God's chosen people, and so, the Jews, they can just go pound sand, and that's not really a good position to take. And actually, what you're doing there is exactly what you accuse the dispensationalists of doing, which is allowing their theology to paint what they're going to do as far as their support or not support of Israel. You're actually falling into the same trap that a lot of the replacement theologists are accusing dispensationalists of. So yeah, there are legitimate reasons for at least being skeptical of maybe we should look into exactly how America is going to be helping Israel financially, and we need to, make sure that there's accountability. I'm okay with those things. As somebody who tends to be much more Fortress America and kind of hands off in a lot of ways on foreign affairs, I sympathize with that position. I really do. But if your position is, well, they're not really Jews or they're not God's people, and so I'm not going to support them, I think that may just be you masking some anti-Semitism. And I say that as not somebody that likes to draw that out quickly. I mean, I'm a conservative on the internet. I've been called every horrible, terrible name to my face, over the phone, through comment section. I've been accused of anti-Semitism myself over and over again. I don't throw that out lightly. But for a lot of the people that are holding that position, just based on the way they talk about this issue, it sounds to me like it got a little bit of anti-Semitism there, and you're just using your theology as an excuse or as a cover to sort of cover that up. I hate to say that, but I think that there's some people out there. Doesn't mean everybody that holds a replacement theology is that way. In fact, from a purely biblical standpoint, I tend to probably at least side closer to you, even though I think you're both wrong on this. I would probably side more with the replacement theologist than I would the dispensational theologist. But ultimately, if you're just using it as a way to hide the fact that you don't like Jews very much, that's something you really need to work on. Because as we saw in Romans 11, it's okay to not hold the Jews in a position of higher prestige in God's eyes, but you certainly don't need to hold them in some kind of contempt just because they're Jews. God doesn't agree with that either. As Paul makes the case in Romans 11, those people need Jesus Christ just as much as we do. And so because of that, there's no like extra contempt that is allowable for a Christian to have against Jews. That's simply something that the Bible would never condone. So ultimately, that's where you kind of come down on it. Even if you think the Jews are not God's people, yeah, well, neither is Hamas. And you certainly shouldn't be supporting them if that's the case. And I really don't think that it's fair to be ambivalent to this. So this is something that I would have talked to a lot of people about. Ultimately, you should not be picking a side based on your theology in this one, because there is no theology that says you have to support Israel or have to support Hamas. So then the question remains, okay, and kind of the title of this episode, what's the Christian supposed to do then? You've talked an awful lot about theology, but now, and you've talked about a lot of the things that don't make sense, but now what do I do? Well, it's actually pretty simple. You support the side that's doing good. You support the side that actually is morally correct according to Christian virtues and ethics. And that side is really clear. In foreign affairs, unfortunately, you're going to come across an awful lot of episodes where there just are no good guys on either side. That happens a lot, especially in the Middle East. You know, when you've got the Sunnis and the Shias at each other's throat, they're trying to murder one another. You've got Iran, which doesn't like Saudi Arabia very much. There are no good guys in that conflict. It's just degrees of bad. And I understand that. This conflict is not one of them. When you have one side trying to do surgical strikes and doing the best that they can to only target militants, and you have the other side that is indiscriminately going door to door, raping women to the point that they break their legs and pelvis, and sometimes people that are, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old girls, raping them and cooking babies in ovens, you don't have to do a whole lot of complicated moral math for that one. It's pretty clear which side is the right side and which side is the wrong side in that one. I get it that sometimes in conflicts you have to kind of both sides it because there's nobody that's good. This is not an example of that. There is very clearly a side that is behaving in a more godly way than the other one, and there's just no comparison there whatsoever. And so the choice in this one is crystal clear to me. We should be supporting Israel, even if you don't agree with sending them monetary aid, which, as somebody who has very libertarian leanings, I understand that. I do. You certainly shouldn't be pulling for the side that's raping women and cooking babies in ovens and beheading them. Like, that's just a very simple calculation to have to make. So ultimately, you just pick the side that's on the side of good. You don't have to, torture yourself about trying to figure out which side that is because it's painfully obvious. Ultimately, what we are always called to do when we're faced with any kind of moral dilemma is always look to the scripture and figure out which side is actually behaving, not which side is, genetically aligned with God, which side is theologically and morally aligned with the way God would want us to conduct ourselves. That's the side you wind up supporting, not because of genetics or anything else. Ultimately, that is the thing that God cares the most about, because he is no respecter of persons. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and head on to a Breaking the Internet and a Daily Dose of Stupid, and that is all coming up in just a second when we come back.
Speech isn't violence. Tolerance isn't love. Disagreement isn't hate. You're listening to Tactics with Caleb Colquitt. If you want to hear more, subscribe to him on YouTube, like him on Facebook, or follow him on Twitter at Tactics Radio.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, just cruising down I-65 North, and if you've been watching my show for any amount of time, you know that I say three things whenever I start this show. Speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Now, I've said these things at the start of my show for a long time now. They've kind of become the motto of the show, but I've had people kind of ask me to elaborate on those things and give an explanation of exactly why I say that at the beginning of every broadcast. So I decided today that I'm going to do a little more elaboration on the third maxim that I always state at the beginning of the show, which is disagreement isn't hate. Now, this one is incredibly important. I don't think that you could point to any one of these three things and say that, okay, this one is by far the most important, because they're all pretty darn important. But this one I think is important for us as a culture right now. They're all eternally true, but this one specifically is something that our society really, really needs to hear. Because there has been a very effective lie that has been perpetrated throughout our society that disagreement is hate. That if you disagree with someone, if you don't like their political stances, if you don't like their religion, if you think that they are wrong in something, it must be because you hate them. But this thing has two meanings. First of all, we need to always remember that just because we disagree with someone, it does not mean we have to hate them. And that protects us from sort of piling up resentment and hatred in our own hearts towards people just because we may disagree. But it's always wise to not assume that the other person hates us just because they happen to have a disagreement with us. And so we have to remember that from both sides, both that it's not wise for us to assume that someone hates us, and also we don't need to use our disagreement as a rationale for hating another person. And the reason that this is so important is because we see this all the time, and sometimes people just say it outright. They just come out and say that. Especially if you're somebody that has kind of conservative, libertarian leanings. It happens on both sides, and I understand that, but it seems very prevalent that if you have those kind of beliefs, that people, especially on the left, because I think it's politically effective as far as the argument goes for rallying people to your side, they just say that you must hate people if you have a disagreement with them. A great example of this is because I am a small government person, and I believe that big government actually harms the people that it claims to help, I tend to not really like things like welfare spending. And usually when I state this, the automatic response to whatever welfare program I'm against, be it Social Security or universal medicine, it's always, oh, you must hate poor people. Well, no, I don't hate poor people. I think that this program is hurting poor people and keeping them in their poverty. But I'm not going to go into the details of that and explain all that, because it's really beyond the scope of what we're talking about here today. I'm just using that as an example that you don't hate people just because you have a disagreement with them. And I think that this is something that actually is not just a political problem, that it is a lie directly from hell itself. And I know that that's a very bold statement, but the reason I'm saying that, there is quite a bit of rationale behind this. Look at the Bible. It is filled with narratives of people that did things that they shouldn't have and needed human beings to come and correct them and point out their flaws. Because as human beings, we're imperfect and we have blind spots. I know that's an uncomfortable truth, but it's true. And because of that, occasionally, we need other people to step in and point out what we are doing wrong. And we could look at any of our Bible heroes and part of the reason I love the Bible is because it does portray its heroes as flawed individuals that need correction. We could look at Paul, we could look at Peter, we could look at Abraham or David. They had people come to them when they were doing something that God wouldn't approve of, and most of the time they didn't even realize they were doing it. They thought they were doing the right thing, and they had someone come along and correct their error, to point out to them, no, what you're doing is not okay. And because of that, they took it seriously, and they contemplated it, and they changed their lives as a result to make themselves more acceptable to God. You see, this is why I say it's a lie directly from hell, because if you assume that the only reason a person would come to correct you, or that a person would have a disagreement with you, is because you hate them, well, the gospel would be impossible to spread then. Because when you look at the gospel, it shows that every person is wrong. Every person has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and we all have these blind spots that we need other people to come and to show us. But if the devil can make you believe that a loving Christian that comes to you in the spirit of wanting to help you actually hates you, and that him pointing out that you have something that you're incorrect on, or that you have a disagreement with him about, that comes to the point of hatred, that will keep the gospel of Christ spreading real fast. But going into all the details and all the arguments really isn't the point. The point is, it's always better to assume that the person doesn't hate you unless you have a really, really good reason for believing that is the case. Because the world needs to understand and know that disagreement isn't hate, and I believe that if we all recognized that and lived by that and understood that just because someone is our political opponent doesn't mean that they hate us and want to ruin our lives, I think that would go a long way in healing the political divides in this country right now. Ultimately, we always have to remember that even if our opponents and our political adversaries do not extend that same courtesy to us, even if they don't assume that we don't hate them just because we disagree, we always have to live up to the mantra in our own lives that even if they don't extend that courtesy to us, that disagreement is not hate.
Speech isn't violence. Tolerance isn't love. Disagreement isn't hate. You're listening to Tactics with Caleb Colquitt. If you want to hear more, subscribe to him on YouTube, like him on Facebook, or follow him on Twitter at Tactics Radio.
I feel a lot better.
I didn't touch anything, I swear!
Oh! Ty, what did you do?
It wasn't my fault!
All right, and welcome back, folks. Thank you so much for being with us here. It's been a while since we've done a Breaking the Internet, but I'm really looking forward to this one. So this is one that was making the rounds, and there's 1,000 like this. And again, we're going to be staying on the same topic of Israel. There's 1,000 different graphics like this. I'm just kind of using this one as more of a placeholder than anything else. But just to kind of give you an idea, this is the kind of thing that we're dealing with. I saw this the other day, and for those of you that may only be listening on the audio version of the podcast, the graphic has a picture of England crossed out, and it has the word Rome written over the island of England. And it says, "This territory below is now Rome. No, this is not a mistake. The Romans occupied England for 366 years, 43 AD to 409 AD, and therefore they have a historic claim to it, and it is now Rome. The region of Jupiter has proclaimed it so. Sorry, the religion of Jupiter has proclaimed it so. Anyone who claims Roman descent can now come here, evict your family, and move into your house. Don't like this logic? Now you know what it feels like to be a Palestinian." So there's a lot wrong with this one, both historically and from an argumentative standpoint. But I want to go ahead and give a disclaimer here, because there's, like I said, there's so much wrong with that, and we're going to go through each and every one of those points. But I want to go ahead and give a disclaimer before we start with anything, that the truth is, I actually kind of agree with the overall premise of this graphic. I know that may surprise you, especially since I'm doing a Breaking the Internet. I actually agree that the idea that we're supposed to just try to figure out and do all this kind of complicated historic math and figure out which nation or which people has a historic claim to a specific spot of land is supposed to be the people that are allowed to live there, that's a dumb thing. That's an incredibly stupid idea. That's something that is not going to benefit anybody. And it's also important to note that when we're going through something like that, when we're trying to figure those things out, nobody's ever going to come out on top of that. You hear a similar argument being made all the time where they're like, oh, well, the Americans, they colonized everybody and they went in and they took over the land. And now we should just give all that land back to the Native Americans. First of all, never met an American that said that was willing to give up their own house or their own land to the Native Americans to do so. So there's that right there. But on top of that, then you'd have to ask, okay, what tribe? Because the Native Americans, which by the way, I have a little bit of a Native American blood in me, so I'm not even completely like divorced from that conversation. Most people in the South do because there were so many Native Americans here. A lot of us intermarried. But when you make that argument doesn't make a ton of sense because you've got the Apache, the Comanche, the Iroquois. There's, just tons of them. The Sioux Indians, the Plains Indians, the Creek Indians. There's all these different tribes, and they fought and killed each other a lot to try to determine who was going to win that land. So which tribe do you give the land back to? Is this Blackfoot territory or is this Iroquois territory? We don't know because they both owned the land at some point. If you're going to strictly hold to the idea of only people that have a historic claim to the land are allowed to live there, all of us are going to be living in a very, very tiny area between the Tigris and Euphrates River. That's just the reality of the thing. Conquest is the history of the human race. And it's impossible to sort out whose land it was first or who really deserves it. Or let's just say that you actually did do something terrible. And there's a house and you took over this house and you basically took over somebody's land. And then 100 years later, your great-great-great-grandson, who is still in that house, some dude that's the great-great-great ancestor of the guy you kicked out of that house says you have to move now. Well, that's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. And your family's been there for decades now. That doesn't justify the initial action, even if there was, some kind of foul play. Whether that's the case or not, it's really impossible to sort that out generations later. And that's kind of the same position that we find ourselves in right now. So ultimately, I just don't believe that the historic claim to a land is a good way of determining who's supposed to be there in the first place. So I reject the premise outright. However, since they're wanting to play this game, let's actually look at what group of people does have a historic claim to the land known as Israel. So let's look at a little bit of history. Biblical Israel, so the people chosen by God whose land was established by God when the promised land was given to them in the days of Abraham that was promised, the days of Moses it was fulfilled, in the days of Moses that was brought to fruition when God takes them out of Egypt, and then it's fulfilled in the days of Joshua, and it comes to its ultimate fulfillment in the days of David and Solomon, where the kingdom of Israel is at its peak. All of the land that was promised to them actually belonged to them during their reigns, and then that broke down when the kingdoms divided. But regardless, that's the history of Israel. But if you're looking at biblical Israel, that was destroyed in about 70 AD. And the reason for that is the Roman Empire went in, sacked the city of Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. That's why the temple has not been rebuilt to this day, is because they destroyed it back in 70 AD. So after the time of Christ, only about a generation after the time of Christ, the kingdom of Israel as a physical state was completely destroyed and decimated. There were still Jews living in that region, but the kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as a geopolitical entity from that day forward, and it's never really recovered up until the point that you have modern Israel, and even that's somewhat debatable if that's the same state, and that's what we're about to talk about. So modern Israel was founded by the Brits in World War II in 1948. So we're talking about an almost 1,000-year gap. It's about 1,800 years. So there's a really, really big gap between that. And not only do you not have the same people occupying it, there's even question about, after that many generations of intermarrying with other people, if you can even be considered the same ethnic group. Now, especially if you're looking at like Moroccan Jews and people of that ilk, they probably are a lot closer genetically to ancient Israel than the more modern Jews that went all throughout Europe are. But really, that's neither here nor there. They all do share Jewish blood. They really are the descendants of Abraham. They share Abraham's blood, which is the big qualifier as to whether or not you're considered Jewish. But ultimately, that modern state of Israel, it was not established by God or promised by God the way that biblical Israel was. It is not a theocracy. They are a secular democracy. And you can agree with that, disagree with that, not like it, but it's the truth. I mean, they don't operate the way that the Torah commands them to operate. They never reestablish the temple. They don't offer live sacrifices. They're not adhering to every letter of the Torah. They're not a theocracy the way that the Bible demands that they be. They are a secular democracy, yes, occupied by Jews, but it's not the nation of Israel as we see it in the Bible. There's no Davidic kingship over Israel as we know right now. And in fact, both the Davidic and the Aaronic lines are broken. That's very important, because when God promised a kingship to David, he did so, and that was going to be in perpetuity. So from then on, there would always be a king after David's lineage. Now, in the time of Jesus, that was fulfilled in the sense that Jesus has been reigning there ever since his death and resurrection, and he's been reigning over his people, just not the Jews proper, or the physical Jews, as it were. But ultimately, so that's where you have that. But the actual Davidic line of a physical king sitting on David's throne, that doesn't exist anymore. The Aaronic line, the descendants of Aaron, who are supposed to be the only people that are allowed to be high priest, that was broken even before the time of Jesus. So in the time of Jesus, you have high priests like Annas and Caiaphas. And so by that point, even then you didn't have high priests that were in the line of Aaron. And so they already were not fulfilling the law of Moses even by the time Jesus comes around. So they have no king, they have no high priest. Israel is not a theocracy. And as we discussed earlier, there is no covenant that God would return them after the initial return after the Babylonian exile. And so ultimately, what we're looking at now is not the kingdom of Israel the way that the Bible describes it. But let's look at Israel as a geopolitical entity and see if there is some kind of historic claim to the land. So I wanted to put together a really cool graphic, but unfortunately there was no way to fit all of this on one screen. So I'm going to just kind of have to read it off to you. Before the conquest, so after the Exodus, but before the conquest of Israel, Israel did not exist as a physical nation with a actual land that they were on. They were a physical nation in the sense that they had exited from Egypt, but they were nomads at that point. They didn't have a homeland. So before the conquest, that would have been about 1407 BC. So 1407 BC, about 1400 years before Jesus is born. That land was ruled by varying tribes of Canaanites. So there's not one particular land. Israel is not one people or one nation. There's a bunch of different tribes of Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, all of those different tribes sort of take turns, and they periodically take over parts of the land, kind of like the Native Americans before the Americans came. They weren't a united land before that point. Then you have the period of Judges after the conquest in 1407, and after the land is established as being part of Israel, you have the period of the Judges between 1320 and 1020 BC. So that's about 200-ish years where the period of Judges are there, and that leads to the kingdom of Israel, which occurs from 1020, which is about the time that Saul would have been coronated as king, up until about 597 BC, where the Babylonians take over the southern kingdom. So you have Assyria conquering the northern kingdom in 721 BC. Then you have the Babylonians conquering the southern kingdom, or Judea, the descendants of Judah in that tribe. That happens in 597 BC, as we already stated. Or sorry, 527. 597 was, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Again, this is why I need a graphic. Babylon conquers the southern kingdom in 597. They return in 527, which is exactly 70 years later, as the Bible predicts. And then you have the Alexander the Great conquering Israel in 329 BC. So after they come back from the exile, they're then under the auspices of the Greek Empire when Alexander the Great conquers them in 329. Then the Greek Empire is divided into 4 different parts in 323, and Israel is ruled by the Ptolemies. So the Ptolemies were one of the 4 sections that the empire was divided off into, and Ptolemy is the one that then rules them, but they're still technically part of the Greek Empire, just not the united Greek Empire at that point. After the Roman Emperor Pompey conquers Jerusalem in 663 BC, then Jews and the Jewish people are under the auspices of the Roman Empire. That sets the stage for the time of Christ. And then the Persians take Israel as the Roman Empire crumbles about AD 614. So the Persians are in charge of it then. The Byzantine Empire, which, by the way, is just sort of an outgrowth of the Greek Empire at this point, the Byzantine Empire recaptures Jerusalem in AD 629. Then Muslim forces capture Jerusalem in AD 638. So it wasn't long afterward, just 9 years after then, that the Muslims actually captured Jerusalem. By the way, that is 6 years after Muhammad dies. So the Muslims do control Jerusalem, but they never do while Muhammad is alive. It's only 6 years after he dies that the Muslims take control of the state of Israel and Jerusalem. Then European Crusaders take control of Jerusalem about 1099. The Egyptian Sultan Saladin captures Jerusalem in AD 1187. Then the Ottoman Empire conquers Israel in 1517. Then the British take over the Ottoman territories in AD 1917. And finally, the League of Nations appoint Britain as administrator of the land in 1922. And of course, that culminates in the British Empire giving the land to the Jews as a modern state of Israel in 1948. So I know that that was an awful lot of history. I mean, we literally covered what? We started in 1407, so that's what, 3,470 years, something like that. A little bit more than that. We covered an awful lot of history of the land of Israel, but that means we have roughly, let's see, that is at least 12 different owners of the land of Israel in Israel's history. But did you notice who was conspicuously absent from that list? Anybody? Palestinians. At no point anywhere in human history has there ever been a people or a nation known as Palestine. That is an inconvenient truth for the people who do not like Israel being there, but it is true. The Palestinians never owned the land of Israel at any point in their history. In fact, there's no such thing as Palestinians. They do not exist as a distinct ethnic group. They just don't. There have been various tribes of Muslims that took over the land at one point or another, but you'll notice there that of all the different people that procured Israel over a period of time, not a single one claimed it as a homeland. It was always some far-off empire that took control of Israel. It was never their homeland. You know, Israel is not the home of Rome. Israel is not the home of the Greeks. Israel is not the home of the Ottoman Empire. It just isn't. It's not their homeland. That doesn't mean they didn't really control it. But if you're asking what nation has a historic claim to the land of Israel, there's only one. There's only one that has ever claimed Israel as its homeland, and it's the Jews. Now, we just went over an entire hour where I explained how I don't believe the Jews are actually God's people anymore. I believe that their purpose was fulfilled in the culmination of the Messiah coming to save mankind. I believe all that, and do to this day. I have no religious reason whatsoever for believing that Israel has a historic claim to this land. But if you're looking through the history and asking yourself, which group of people claims this land as their homeland, there's only one group of people that you can say that about Israel, and it's the Jews. All the other different people that claimed it over the centuries and centuries of history we went over, they were all outsiders that claimed it as a territory. They never actually owned it as a homeland for themselves. And that's just something that is true if you're looking at the historic record. Doesn't mean there weren't people that were living in there that were not Jewish. I mean, to this day, about 20% of Israel's population are Muslim Arabs. That doesn't change the fact that that's not their homeland. It's fine that they're there, and Israel's fine with them being there as long as they're peaceful. And much of them are. If they thought that they weren't, they would have gotten rid of them. But my point in all of that is there's not a single other group of people in all of that history that ever claimed Israel as its homeland. So if you're asking that, it's like, well, if that's the case, Caleb, how on earth did the Palestinians even come to be? Where did they come from? Who are they? So I'll actually go over the origin story of that. After quelling a Jewish uprising in AD 135, Rome renamed the region Syria Palestinia. This is a name in Latin that is a transliteration of the Hebrew Yudaha, meaning Philistine. Now, the Philistine people don't exist anymore. They've been wiped out for almost 2,000 years. They've long since been extinct. So why did Rome call them Philistines? That's what Palestinian means. It's a transliteration of the word Philistine. They did it as an insult. I don't know if you've ever seen the show Code Geass, but it's a alternate reality, and it happens in the not super distant future. It's like the year 2300 or something like that. So, about a couple centuries into the future from where we are now. 2200, 2300, something like that. Anyway, so they have a world where there's only 3 governments left. So everything is under the auspices of one of these 3 empires. One of them is the British Empire, and it takes over the region of Japan. And when they do so, they cease to call it Japan. They call it District 11. And they refer to the Japanese people not as Japanese, but as 11s. It's a dehumanizing tactic. They do so specifically to rid people of their identity. And so they do exactly the same thing. A lot of people don't realize this, and I didn't realize it until I started going to Ukraine. Ukrainians just refer to themselves as Ukrainians, and they just refer to their country as Ukraine. It's not the Ukraine. The reason that some people refer to it as the Ukraine, and again, I'm not saying that everybody that does that, because I used to do it, was doing so through some kind of malice. It was just ignorance. The reason that people started doing that is because the Russians started that trend, because they wanted people to think of the Ukraine as, like in America, we call it the South, not an actual distinct designated area where there's a distinct group of people, but just another part, basically a vestigial organ of the Roman Empire. That's how they wanted people to perceive it. It's just another part of the USSR. And that's why they started calling it as the Ukraine instead of Ukraine. They didn't see it as an individual nation. In the same way the British did not see the Japanese as an individual nation in that fictional story I just said. And that's exactly what's going on here. The Romans did that to the Jews because they wanted to beat them down and so demoralize them that they wanted them to no longer think of themselves as an individual people. And so ironically, even the phrase Palestinian is wrought with anti-Semitism and was from its very origin. The whole purpose of that word existing is to try to dehumanize the Jews and treat them as though they are not a distinct ethnic group. That was always the purpose of it. And so because of that, that's where you get the word Palestinian. And ironically, if you know that and understand it, if you also know the history that Rome did not even very specifically talk about the kingdom of Israel or the region of Israel as Palestinia. They use it to refer to basically the entire area. So again, it's like the South or the Northeast or the Mountain West. The way that they use that term, again, because it's demoralizing, is they treat it as just sort of a generic term for the region where the Philistines used to live, which is sort of all over. It's Israel, but there's also certain things that are not Israel, like Jordan and parts of Egypt and all kinds of other stuff. And so the origin word of Palestine is even anti-Semitic in and of itself. And so ultimately they artificially wanted to alienate the Jews from their homeland, and that's the reason that exists. And the Palestinians, per se, they're not a specific or distinct group of people. They never have been. They never will be. That's just a word that was made up. And the thing is, the Palestinians are not even a single group to this very day. They're still made up of several different diverse tribes. They're not even one people even now. And so the idea that the Palestinians have some historic right to the land, they don't have a historic right to any land because they're not even an actual people. Now, that doesn't mean that the people that are referred to as Palestinians in the modern day are not human, doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about them, doesn't mean that they need a place to live too, and all of those things. Now, the ones that have sided with Hamas, I think that they forfeited their right to live a long time ago, but that's really not the point of what we're talking about now. I'm not saying that the people in the region known as Palestine are insignificant and should not be, will have claimed it to the land of Israel and calling it Palestine. That just simply doesn't exist and never has. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take another quick break. Again, I do think the historic argument is stupid, but if that is your standard, then it's very clear who is actually supposed to be the historic inheritor of the land of Israel. So what we'll do is we'll take a quick break here and we'll be back in just a second right here on Tactics.
Speech isn't violence. Tolerance isn't love. Disagreement isn't hate. You're listening to Tactics with Caleb Colquitt. If you want to hear more, subscribe to him on YouTube, like him on Facebook, or follow him on Twitter at Tactics Radio.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible that doesn't have a leather-bound version because leather is murder. Today's reading will come from the book of Genesis, chapter 2, verses 15 through 24, which states, "Then the Lord God took the gender-neutral person and put Z in the Garden of Eden to enjoy it and post a lot of pics on social media for him to enjoy. The Lord God commanded the gender-neutral person, saying, 'From any organically sourced, GMO-free tree of the garden you may freely eat, even the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat from it, you will certainly die, but I'm not here to judge or to tell you how to live your life. You do you.' Then the Lord God said, 'It is not good for Adam to be alone. I will make Z another person, exactly the same as Zer, so that they will be equal in every way. And out of the ground the Lord formed every animal of the field and every bird of the sky over billions of years through theistic evolution, and brought them to the gender-neutral person to see what Z would call them. And whatever Adam called a living creature, that was its name, unless it identified as something else, because Adam understood that animal lives matter and are equal to ours. The gender-neutral person gave names to all the livestock and to the birds of the sky and to every animal of the field. But for Adam, there was not found an equal that could totally do everything Z can do. So the Lord God pulled a Bill Cosby and caused a deep sleep to fall on the gender-neutral person, and Z slept. Then God took one of Z's ribs and closed up the flesh at that place, totally proving that God wants all surgeries to be free. And the Lord God fashioned into another gender-neutral person the rib which God had taken from the other gender-neutral person, and brought Z to the other Z. Then Z said, 'At last, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Not that I'm claiming any type of ownership or patriarchal arrangement. Z shall be called gender-neutral person, because Z was taken out of the first gender-neutral person. For this reason, a gender-neutral person shall leave his patriarchal oppressor and his birthing person, and be joined to his life partner, and they shall become one flesh, no matter what gender or species or age they are.'" Wow, so inspiring. This has been another reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
Speech isn't violence. Tolerance isn't love. Disagreement isn't hate. You're listening to Tactics with Caleb Colquitt. If you want to hear more, subscribe to him on YouTube, like him on Facebook, or follow him on Twitter at Tactics Radio.
I did think it was actually pretty funny there. Didn't think about it beforehand, but it says to follow us on Twitter, which I guess no longer exists anymore because it's technically X. But on top of that, I've been banned from Twitter for over a year now, so you can tell that's old imagery. But anyway, yeah, we are back, and we're going to go ahead and jump into the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And for today's daily dose of stupid, we have TikTok, which is pretty much always stupid, so it just fits right in. Apparently, TikTok has discovered Osama bin Laden. Yes, that Osama bin Laden, the one that crashed planes into the World Trade Center. They have discovered his letter to America, which explains why he did that. And apparently they agree with him an awful lot because a rash of TikTokers has come forward and explained that actually Osama bin Laden was right in doing what he did in a lot of ways. So let's go ahead and hear from some of the geniuses over there at TikTok.
So I just read A Letter to America, and I will never look at life the same. I will never look at this country the same. I will never, please read it. And if you have read it, let me know if you are also going through an existential crisis in this very moment.
And actually, before you even read the letter, I did want to mention, in reading the letter, I could only think of this tweet that I saw the other day. Under settler colonialism, any kind of resistance is branded as terrorist because the only acceptable violence is violence by the occupier.
So this is insane. I just read Osama bin Laden's letter to America, which I will be going through right here. Reading this letter, it becomes apparent to me that the actions of 9/11 and those acts committed against the USA and its people were all just the buildup of our government failing other nations.
The way this letter is going viral right now is giving me the greatest sense of relief. If you're Muslim and you've lived in the US since 9/11, you know more truth than the typical citizen. Now it's all coming to light because of Palestine.
Okay, now you're probably going to be watching that and sitting there thinking, Caleb's just going to rip into these people. And I am, but I'm going to give you a take here that I don't think you're going to see in many other conservative circles. And I know that this story has had some time to age, and so may have had a little more time to reflect on it and everything. But I'm going to give you an answer I don't think you expected here today. I think they're right. Now, they're not morally right, so before you start throwing things at your computer screen, do understand what I'm saying here. If you start out from a premise or a worldview that is completely devoid of God, that really takes the sort of Marxian worldview that they subscribe to, actually Osama bin Laden's letter makes a lot of sense. Now, the problem is that is a bat crap crazy worldview to have to start with. I'm just saying that this is something that actually shouldn't be surprising, and they're not wrong if you're starting at it from their premise. You know, it's kind of like, I think that moral relativism is an abysmal blight on humanity that has led to a ton of human suffering. However, if you're starting at it from the angle of God doesn't exist and basically you should just pursue whatever suits you and whatever pleasures that you feel are best in your short existence here on this, temporary plane, I have a hard time arguing with that. Because within that very specific worldview, the conclusion actually makes sense. Now, you're starting from a false premise, but if you do start from that false premise, it makes sense that you wind up at that conclusion. And so I think that that's actually what's going on here. A lot of conservative commentators, which I've enjoyed it too. I'm not saying that I don't get a good chuckle out of this as well, but they look at this and talk about, oh, how stupid these guys are. No, actually, if you're starting from their premise, where they end up makes a lot of sense. They're not morally correct, but they're right within their own bubble worldview. And the reason is because ultimately they live in a world where there are only two kinds of people. And this is where the Marxism comes in. There are occupiers and there are oppressors. There are occupiers who are oppressors and there's the oppressed. That's it. That's the only two categories you have. And so the way that they see it, especially because a lot of them consider Jews to be white people, well, this is just another form of colonialism. This is just a bunch of white people. By the way, Jews are not white people. A lot of the Jews that have been intermarried with and have gone through generations in Europe look more white than some of their other Jewish counterpoints, but there's an awful lot of brown Jews as well, which I know blows a lot of the leftist mind. They don't realize that. But anyway, so they see this as just another colonial outpost, just a bunch of white people oppressing and taking advantage of and exploiting a bunch of poor brown people. That's really the only thing they see. They only see race and they only see class. They're incapable of seeing anything else. And so within that very limited worldview, everything that they're saying makes a lot of sense. And because of that, because they see one group as solely, totally evil, the oppressors, and one group as solely, totally good, the oppressed, then any action, regardless of how bad it is, taken by the oppressed against the oppressors, well, that's justified. It doesn't matter how bad it is, doesn't matter how evil it is, doesn't matter if innocent people get hurt along the way, as long as the oppressed are doing it and it hurts the oppressors, they're fine with it. This was the same stance that before he actually did start to see some of the error of his ways. I'm not saying that he completely turned over a new leaf, but we actually saw later in life Malcolm X started to come around a little bit. Before that happened, that's how Malcolm X thought. He thought, okay, well, if we're really oppressed, and by the way, in the 60s, you could make a pretty strong case for that. They really were. Well, then anything we do, any violence, anything that we do that hurts the oppressors, that's fine. There's a lot of people on the left today that never grew out of that mentality. In their mind, any ends justifies, the end just justifies any means that they take to try to get to that end. And that's who they are. So ultimately, this is just all Marxism in that oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. So let's go ahead and take a look at another group of these clips, because I think that this is important as well.
Everyone to stop what they're doing right now and go read. It's literally 2 pages. Go read A Letter to America. And please come back here and just let me know what you think, because I feel like I'm going through like an existential crisis right now, and a lot of people are. So I just need someone else to be feeling this too.
No one in America ever really was given the information of why did this happen? Why did 9/11 happen? And also, why did the 93 at the World Trade Center happen? Like, the American people were never actually given logical reason. It was just that these people hate us because of our freedom, and that was the propaganda fed. It's Western freedom. It's their Western ideals of freedom, whatever that means. And so it's freedom for white people.
I just read A Letter to America. Have you read that shit? If you haven't read it yet, I think if you go on the internet, it's not there because the U.S. government is trying to remove it because they don't want us to see the letter to America. Why don't they want us to see A Letter to America? A Letter to America is a letter to America written by Osama bin Laden, basically explaining why he attacked on 9/11. Why did they attack on September 11th? Osama bin Laden basically said in a nutshell, not only do you keep with us, but you keep with everybody. You're dropping bombs on people and it's fine, but when we do it, we're terrorists. And I'm not here to defend anybody, but I am here to say we gotta do some algebra here. If we're gonna call Osama bin Laden terrorist, so is the American government.
So a couple things I will point out very quickly. First of all, when you're looking at TikTok, one of the things that as a professional broadcaster I find really funny is these people can't go like literally a sentence without having to do a retake. So you'll see when I'm doing my live show, you don't get a lot of jumps and cuts. Those happen occasionally when I pre-record an interview or something like that, but that's pretty rare. And granted, I'm not the world's best communicator. There's a reason for that. But it's just funny to me that these people literally can't do, because first of all, a lot of the stuff that they're spouting is nonsense, and so it's hard to follow a logical trail. But they literally can't do more than like 4 or 5 words without having to cut and then record again. So that's already a pretty strong indicator that we're not dealing with the sharpest pencils in the toolbox there. Or the sharpest tool in the pencil box, whichever way you want to put it. But the second thing is, I want you to notice a few things specifically that were pointed out there, and we'll go from beginning to end. You notice how the first woman, completely ignorant of the situation, says she's never even heard of this thing, didn't know it existed. If today is day 1 of you having studied the Middle Eastern conflict, maybe it's not the best idea that your first action is to go to TikTok and talk to other people about it. Like, maybe learn and then do a video about it. like you'll see here, because at the show we always post our sources and we want to make sure that people are educated, and I try to do a lot of research, sometimes multiple days of research to do even a single hour-long show. That's just the way that it works here. And these guys, it seems like they read something for 10 minutes, don't put together any coherent thoughts whatsoever, and just jump on to give their immediate raw reaction. And I mean, there's some value in it, because obviously we're sitting here talking about it, and I got to be honest, watching how stupid these people are can be kind of funny. But my point in all of that is, if this is the first time you've ever ventured into a subject matter, maybe the first thing you should be doing is not going on the internet and telling other people how to think. So that's the first step. Second step, you'll notice that she's really just looking for emotional validation. Just like let me know if like there's other people out there that are feeling the same thing that I'm feeling when I read this. No one cares how you feel. No one cares how you feel. It is immaterial. And I don't really care whether you support Hamas, whether you support Israel. I don't care about any of those things if they're based on your emotions. How you're feeling is not a good rubric, or not a good measuring stick for how you should determine your position in international conflicts. It's just not a smart thing to do. But to the left, since everything's morally subjective, emotional validation is really the only thing that they're looking for. That's why you have people like the Queers for Palestine, that even though the Palestinians that they claim to be champion would throw them off a building face first because they're homosexual, and would not think 2 seconds about it. Like they would go outside, murder a homosexual, drop him off a building, and not only not feel bad about it, they would go about their day just like it was a normal day. Like, you know, killing a homosexual is like going to the DMV for them. Like, it's just a mundane task. It's just something they got to do. Despite that, they still support these people because, again, it's all about what feels good, not about what actually makes sense. All these people are looking for is some type of emotional validation, and that's why they gravitate towards this letter to America, is because they feel as though this is giving them a justification for the feelings they've had that really everything has to be America's fault. And that's the thing that we saw in the videos that followed up after that one as well. You'll notice that the second woman there was just saying, oh, it's just Western freedom. It's just white freedom. So in other words, you're not actually arguing with the topic at hand. You're just saying, because the wrong people believe this, or the people that I don't like believe it, it must not be true. She doesn't provide any evidence. She doesn't say, well, actually, here's the history on that. She provides nothing of use. She just says, well, these are the people that I know I'm supposed to dislike. And so anything that confirms that preconceived notion or that worldview that I had going into it, that must be a good thing. You see, that's the thing. They are the measuring stick. They don't believe there's an objective morality out there that says, no, killing 3,000 innocent people is incorrect. You don't just go out and kill innocent civilians that have never done you any harm because you felt like it. See, because they are their own moral compass, and what they feel is their moral compass, then if that happened, then there must have been a good reason for it. And so anything that confirms that thing that they already determined that they wanted to feel, well, then that must be right. And that's why, again, I say, if you're looking at it from their worldview, the fact that they like the letter to America actually makes quite a bit of sense. Ultimately, that's where we go with this, is that that's how they view it. But let's look at, because I thought that that was an interesting point. That's white freedom. Well, what does that mean? See, the thing is, they try to say, well, there's other freedom out there, and freedom means something different to you. First of all, I hate this movement to make words not mean things. If a word doesn't mean something, then there's no purpose for the word existing. I'll use one from Boy Meets World that character made up, a goubois. Okay, well, if you don't know what a goubois is, then saying it makes no sense because you don't know what it means. And so it serves no purpose to say a meaningless nothing word. And they're trying to devolve a lot of words. So freedom just doesn't mean anything. Freedom means whatever you want it to mean. Okay, well, then it means nothing. If that's what freedom is, it means nothing. And here's the thing. The truth is, the Palestinians, the Arabs, all those different people, they don't believe in freedom. They don't want freedom. And so you can poo-poo freedom or say that it's a bad thing or say, well, that's white freedom. Well, the reason for that is because the Muslims, they don't actually want freedom at all. And if you don't believe me, you can go ahead and look at this graphic. These are polls taken of people living in the area. So this specifically is a poll of people living in the Gaza Strip in the West Bank. So the Palestinians, as it were. You can look there at this question: how much do you support the military operation carried out by the Palestinian resistance led by Hamas on October 7th? You got 63% extremely support, 14.8% somewhat support in the West Bank, and then similar numbers in the Gaza Strip, for a total of 75% supporting it. So you got 75% of the people that are deemed Palestinian that actually say, yeah, raping women, beheading babies, cooking children in ovens, all of that stuff, 100% thumbs up. We love it. Do more of it. How do you deal with people like that? These are people that don't want freedom. They want dead Jews. That is the goal. I know that's uncomfortable. I don't like saying it because I wish it weren't true, but it is. They don't want freedom. They want Hamas to kill more Jews. That is the goal. They have no desire to be free as we understand it. They just want Jews to be dead. And this would be true whether it were in Israel or anywhere else. These are the same people that throw parades when you have Muslim terrorists killing people at Charlie Hebdo in Paris. They don't care where the Jews are. They just want the Jews dead. Like, they'd rather them not be in Israel, obviously. But ultimately, they don't care about that. They just want all the Jews to be dead. That's why they chant the things they do. That's why they chant death to the Jews. That's why they say that they'll eliminate them all and refer to them as Satan and all of these other things. They just want dead Jews, and that poll proves that. The vast majority of the citizens there, they like that stuff. That's what they want. Let's also look at this poll. So this one from the same group, the Arab World for Research and Development. How do you view the role of the following parties? And so this particular one is Hamas. You've got, again, over 70% approval for Hamas. Almost 80. So the idea that these people, they just, as Americans, we want to believe that everybody really wants freedom. They really don't. Most people do not want that. We want freedom. We hold it as a very high virtue, but most people don't. That's a sad reality, but it's the truth. They would much rather have an organization that represents them, that wants to kill as many Jews and as many Americans and as many non-Muslims as possible. That's the goal. That's what they actually want. They don't care about freedom. And so, in some sense, the woman that was on that video earlier is right, that they don't care about it. And this is the real clincher for all of this. This is a poll that was conducted by all Muslim countries in the Pew Research Center. So this is a percentage of Muslims in favor of making Islamic law, Sharia law, the official law of their country. Now, it varies somewhat in these different regions, and you can tell that there's more support for that than others in certain regions. But look down at Palestinian territories. 89%. Have you read Sharia law? I have. There's nothing freeing about it. It dictates everything down to how many times you have to pray, and that women aren't allowed to leave the house without having themselves covered head to toe and with a male relative and all these other. There's no freedom in Sharia law, believe me. And yet, that's what 89% of Palestinians want. They want the Jews out, and they want to create their own state where they operate by Sharia law. That's what they desire. They don't want freedom. If they did, they'd already be living in Israel, where 20% of the population are Arab Muslims and live quite freely. Those are the people that are already there. And so this idea that people just really yearn for freedom, I'm sorry, they don't. The stats just do not bear that out. There's no evidence of that. And then I want to get to the last guy real quick, because I thought that his was really good as well. At least it gives us insight into the enemy's worldview. So basically, I found his funny because it started out incorrect. He said, well, the government's trying to keep us from getting it. No, the Guardian removed it. We was talking about they're censoring us and they don't want us to read Letter to America. Yeah, that wasn't the federal government, even though, I mean, the federal government's full of leftists at this point. I would have no scruples about being upset with them for censoring it, but they didn't. In fact, I saw the Letter to America on a government website. So they're not trying to hide it. What he was accusing the people of hiding it, that was actually the Guardian that removed it, which is a very left-leaning news website. So first of all, you can tell this guy's an idiot because he doesn't even know the story or know what he's talking about. But he also got to the point where he's saying, well, ultimately, if we're going to call what Osama bin Laden did with bombing the World Trade Center terrorism, well, then that means that because we bomb people in those countries that we must be terrorists too. It's the same thing. No, but he comes from a world, again, where all actions are morally equivalent. Al-Qaeda versus America is the same thing as Hamas versus Israel. Ultimately, if the end result is killing a person, well, then that action is morally equivalent. Well, it can be, but there's a world of difference in shooting a guy in the head because you wanted his wallet versus shooting a guy in the head because he was about to commit a rape. Like, those are two completely different things. There is a world of moral difference between those two. One, you're actually defending somebody, whereas the other one, you're doing something to enrich yourself. And so there's times where exactly the same action can be completely different based upon the context they're in. And it's so funny to me that whenever Hamas does something, all the people on the left want to roll out, whoa, we've got to add context, and we have to add this in the context of the full conflict, which, by the way, I'm fine with. It's just they never actually do that. But then the second Israel does the same thing, that no context. Can you believe that? That was outrageous that they bombed a school bus. Well, the school bus was being used to transport terrorists and terrorist supplies. So, well, that doesn't matter. You see, they're all in favor of the context when they think the context helps them. And they don't want to add the context when they think it works against them. I just say add the context into every situation. But that's the calculus that he won't make. If one country is bombing another country or one terrorist group is bombing another terrorist group, well, they're all just morally equivalent. We can't just sit here on our moral high horse and say that it's wrong for the Al-Qaeda organization or the Taliban to fly a plane into the World Trade Center and kill 3,000 innocent people if we're also going to go out there and do precision strikes and kill terrorist leaders like Osama bin Laden. Yes, we can. Those two things are very, very different. And so this is the moral idiocy and the very low level moral reasoning that we see in society today. It's unfortunate, but the common thread in all of this is total and utter ignorance. People that admittedly, by their own admission, didn't know about any of this stuff, never heard of any of this stuff, and then just picked up the letter one day and they're like, oh, well, they're treating it as though it's divine revelation taken down from Mount Sinai, and they treat it that way. It's absolutely absurd. But I want you to actually look at this letter. I want you to read the actual letter. That was the one thing that I actually wound up agreeing with them on. Everybody, every American should read this letter. And there's some discrepancy because of some of the things that they cited. I think that they're actually confused because there's actually two letters to America. There's, I believe, a 2014 one and a 2002 one. I've read them both. Well, I say that. I've read most of the 2014 one. It's actually like 38 pages long, I think, the 2014 version. So I've read most of it. The 2002 one only is like a few pages long. So I've read, let's see, the 2002 one is, I think, 8 pages. And she said it was 2 pages. So I think she's actually thinking of a different letter. But there's one that's like 38 pages. So again, it depends on which letter you're talking about. But the one that they seem to be referencing and the one that was taken down from the Guardian was the 8-page one that came out in 2002. So that's the one we're going to look at today. So real quick, let's just go ahead and look at these things. And you might actually see why their worldview tends to line up with it quite nicely and why the left was freaked out by the fact they thought that even that was a bridge too far for them. So they didn't want these young, impressionable liberals picking up on Osama bin Laden's ideas because they know how bad that makes them look. So let's go ahead and look at the first segment of this letter. Well, I say it's not in chronological order. This is just done based on topic. So you'll see there's several things about Osama bin Laden's letter. First of all, he'll say Palestine, which is sunk under military occupation for more than 80 years, the British handed over Palestine with your help and support, talking about America there. To the Jews who have occupied it for more than 50 years, years overflowing with oppression, tyranny, crimes, killing, expulsion, destruction, and devastation, the creation and continuation of Israel is one of the greatest crimes, and you are the leaders of its criminals. And then he, of course, goes on, and then he says the creation of Israel is a crime which must be erased. So you can already see this lines up with pretty much everything that the left has been chanting and the left has been saying for the past several weeks since this conflict started. So it's really no surprise that they would find themselves aligned with Osama bin Laden. And then it goes on to say, you are the nation that permits usury, which has been forbidden by all religions. That's true. That's not true, but I won't go into that right now. Yet you build your economy on investments and usury. As a result of this, in all its different forms and guises, the Jews have taken control of your economy, through which they have taken control of your media and control aspects of your life, making them servants and achieving their aims at your expense, precisely what Benjamin Franklin warned against. Then he goes on to say, you steal our wealth and oil, paltry prices of your international influence and military threats. This theft is the biggest theft ever witnessed by mankind in the history of the world. Your forces occupy our countries. You spread your military bases throughout them. You corrupt our lands. You besiege our sanctuaries to protect the security of the Jews and ensure your continuity of your pillage of our treasures. Sorry. So it's real easy to see here that most of this stuff is just boilerplate anti-Semitism. There's really nothing special or new about it. It's not even like the new anti-Semitism we see from places like the alt-right or the neo-Nazi movement. It's really just like plain old anti-Semitism that's been around for thousands of years. It's this whole thing about Jews controlling you with money and Jews controlling you with your media and all these other things. So apparently just like standard anti-Semitic tropes are the things that have wowed these people and said, you know what, he makes a really, really good, solid point. But the reason that they're saying that is because all of the stuff that he's saying meshes in really well with modern leftism, because the left itself has become wildly anti-Semitic. Let's look at this next one. Also, the American army is part of the American people. It is the very same people who are shamelessly helping the Jews fight against us. And then he goes on, this is why the American people cannot be innocent in all of the crimes committed by the Americans and Jews against us. Again, just more anti-Semitism. We hate you because you support the Jews. Then he goes on, we also call you to deal with us and interact with us on the basis of mutual interests and benefits, rather than the policies of subdual, theft, and occupation, and do not continue your policy of supporting the Jews, because this will result in more disasters for you. If you fail to respond to all these conditions, then prepare for a fight with the Islamic nation. I mean, and then he goes on to quote a verse from the Quran. That's about as clean cut as it gets. It's very clear that what he's saying there is that you are supporting the Jews. That is why we oppose you. And the only way that you will not be fighting a war with us, which I don't believe that for a second, but he said that the only way to stop this war is if you stop supporting the Jews. So the mere fact of wanting Israel to exist and have their own nation and be able to stay on their land, that apparently is enough for Osama bin Laden to kill innocent women and children. And somehow in the minds of these idiot young people, they think that, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. It's because we're supporting the Jews and want the Muslims to not kill them. So I guess that in their mind is justification enough to bomb innocent people. Oh, you mean we're not letting them kill innocent Jews? So the proper response to that is, of course, to kill innocent Americans. How do these people, these people probably have driver's license. That scares the crap out of me. These guys are imbeciles. But this is what they've been fed their entire lives, and because of that, they go along with it. Let's go and look at another part of this letter. The freedom and democracy that you call for yourselves, again, we're not a democracy, even bin Laden apparently doesn't understand this, for yourselves is for the white race only. Again, that mirrors exactly what the lady was saying in the video, that it's white freedom and it's Western freedom. As for the rest of the world, you impose them on your monstrous restrictive policies and governments, which you call American friends, yet you prevent them from establishing democracies. When the Islamic Party of Algeria, we'll go into that. We'll just skip ahead from that one. Let's see. Okay, here we go. You have destroyed nature with your industrial waste and gases. In history, your law is the law of rich and wealthy people who hold sway in their political parties and fund their election campaigns with gifts. Behind them stand the Jews who control your policies and media economy. So again, we're going back to the Jews are controlling the media and the economy and everything else. But he also is like, well, it's your freedom is really only for white people, and that's what you really need. And you've also destroyed nature with your industrial race, and your law is the law of wealthy people. Again, every single one of these talking points, I guarantee you I could walk on any Ivy League campus and like 95% of the people would say all of this stuff. And so when you wonder, how is it that these people could be roped in by this? It's because he's saying exactly the same thing that their idiot professors in all of these elite universities are saying. So let's go ahead and move on to the next segment of this. These tragedies and calamities are only a few examples of your oppression and aggression against us. It is commanded by our religion and intellect that the oppressed have a right to return the aggression. So again, victimhood status, the left's favorite thing. Well, they're victims, so of course any action that they take against the oppressor is justified because they're the oppressor. Do not await anything from us but jihad, resistance, and revenge. Is it in any way rational to expect that after America has attacked us for more than half a century, that we will leave her in security and peace? Again, they always try to paint America as the aggressor. They never actually add any context or explain, well, there were people killing our people, and so that's the reason we had to go in and kill them. It's exactly the way they're treating Israel now. Doesn't matter that you went in and raped and killed people on October the 7th. It's still wrong for you to go in and to try to bust up a hospital, even if we know for a fact that their headquarters is located directly under the hospital. It's the same kind of rationale. Then he goes on to say, this argument contradicts your continuous repetition that America is the land of freedom and the leaders in this world. Therefore, the American people are the ones who choose their government by way of their own free will, a choice which stems from their agreement to their policies. Thus, the American people have chosen, consented to, and affirmed their support for the Israeli oppression of Palestinians, the occupation and usurpation of their land, and its continuous killing, torture, and punishment and expulsion of the Palestinians. Again, show me an ounce of evidence for any of that. If anything, I think Israel is way too meticulous in these things. I think that they need to take the gloves off a little bit. But that's where we are. Again, it fits into every left-wing talking point. And the thing is, for years, the left has had a cognitive dissonance about this. They know that it's wrong. It's hard for them to deny that it's wrong to fly a plane into a building and kill a bunch of innocent civilians. But as people that believe that America is the source of all evil, and that they must be wrong in some way, and that ultimately people aren't bad. You remember when Rosie O'Donnell, who is a lesbian herself and would be killed immediately if she visited one of these countries, she said, well, even the people that flew the planes into the buildings, they're not bad people. That goes into their worldview too. You remember we covered this. This is one of the big lies that the left tells, is that they believe that people are basically good, and that ultimately it's society that corrupts them. All people are born inherently good. It's just that all these bad ideologies or whatever come by, or, they're retaliating against us, or it's somehow America's fault. We're the only country in the world that has agency and can make its own decisions, apparently. But that's how they view this thing. Ultimately, they believe that if we are attacked, it's ultimately our fault because people are genuinely good people. No, they're not. People are terrible. Spend 5 minutes with any of them. You'll find that out very soon. It's not society's influence. It's that people, by their very nature, are selfish and evil. Now, the biblical worldview would suggest this, and then also say, but then they can be redeemed by giving their lives over to Christ. All people are evil. They have depravity. They do not want things that are for the greater good. They are ultimately self-interested, but through Jesus Christ, they can overcome that. The non-biblical worldview says the opposite, that people are basically good and they just get corrupted. It's not true. I have a whole episode about that. I won't go into more detail because you can go back and watch it on this channel if you want. But that's really the problem that the left has been dealing with ever since the beginning of this thing, is that they ultimately wanted that to be true, and they had no way to justify that when they see the atrocities of 9/11. They come across this letter and like, oh, you see, it really wasn't their fault. It really wasn't their fault. It was ultimately our fault, or how we failed we as Americans failed other countries. No, there are some people that are just terrible, horrible people that do hate you. That can be true as well. So let's go on, and this really sort of is the cherry on top of the whole thing. This was, I thought, the most telling of all the TikTok clips, and I'm sure you'll be able to see why.
This morning I read Letter to America, which is Osama bin Laden's letter to America explaining why he attacked Americans. And I am ashamed to say that I not only have never read this letter, but I didn't even know this letter existed. It's wild, and everyone should read it. If you haven't read it yet, read it. And I feel the same exact way I felt when I was deconstructing Christianity. I feel a little bit just confused, like I have entered into another timeline. What is this?
All right, so you can see there, and I'm sure that you caught on to it. The whole thing is, oh, well, it's just like when I was deconstructing Christianity. It's like I've gone into another timeline. Yeah, that's the point I've been making since the beginning of this. The reason that people are seeing this incorrectly is because they have an incorrect worldview. They're viewing it through a dirty lens. And so ultimately, the reason that I say, and I know it's a bit controversial, but the reason that I say they're actually right is because if you're looking at it through the same lens that they are, they're actually reaching the correct conclusion. It's just the lens that they're looking through is a bad lens. It's a dirty lens. And so ultimately, that's where we wind up. The truth is, that last video, I straight up thought it was a Babylon Bee parody. I really did. Like, I watched it and then saw her mannerism and the fact that she's a seemingly well-to-do white lady that has probably never worked a day in her life, saying all of these things is like, oh, it's just like when I was deconstructing Christianity, I was like, that's got to be a parody. But apparently it's real. And so she's just saying the quiet part out loud. Ultimately, when you have a godless worldview, these are the kinds of idiotic moral decisions that you wind up with. Because if criminals and terrorists are not bad, then they just have bad circumstances, then you have to figure out a way to justify that in your mind in order to see the atrocities that they commit and simultaneously figure that out. So if you see, throngs of women and children that were murdered on October 7th and countless rapes and just babies being killed in horrific ways, the only way to sync that with your worldview that everybody's basically good is that, oh, well, something terrible must have happened to them. There must be some kind of circumstance that explains why they are the way they are. Well, there is. It's they're human beings, and they also have a godless worldview, and that's what led them to this. And so ultimately, that's where they are. And when I say godless, I'm not saying that they don't have a God. Of course, they worship Allah. I'm saying godless in the sense that it is absent of the true character of God. But ultimately, this was the same policy, because, idiots on TikTok, what they think is really not that big a deal. You can find a stupid person that believes almost anything. There's whole channels dedicated to flat earthers. So the fact that you can find idiots out there is really not that big a deal. But here's the reason why it is a big deal, and the reason that I chose to feature it on the Daily Dose of Stupid. It's not just idiots on TikTok. They're merely articulating the actual beliefs of the left. If you don't believe me, remember when Barack Obama basically said the biggest problem with the Middle East and the reason that there's all this turmoil over there and the reason they're all fighting and can't get along with one another was because they need jobs. See, if we could just give them the same things that we have, then they would think exactly the same thing we would. That's the reason that he's shipping, thousands and thousands of dollars in euros, by the way, because it's illegal for the president to send dollars over there because it would violate our policy of paying off terrorists in order to get hostages back. You see, ultimately, that was Barack Obama's worldview too, and it manifested itself in his policies. That's why it's not just a bunch of random idiots on TikTok saying stupid things. That's what we've been watching, but it's not just them. These are making real policy differences because this is the same worldview that Barack Obama did, and he's come to the same conclusions. He just has the good sense not to say them out loud. And so because of that, we're seeing through the actions of leftist politicians, the manifestation of the idiotic ideas that these people on TikTok are articulating. And that's why ultimately it's so dangerous. And ultimately, the common denominator for all of it is a hatred of God. In the same way that the Muslims hate a God of life that loves everybody and wants to have everybody be saved and come into the knowledge of his son, Jesus Christ, you also have the leftists that align with that worldview that ultimately also hate the idea of a loving God that commands and demands things of them in that sense. And so that's why, in a weird sense, even though they hate each other and will wind up killing each other if given the opportunity, at least to align themselves against the ideas of God, they will join forces with one another. You'll have the rainbow flags flying right next to the jihad flags, even though they'll all murder each other the second that there is no longer a godly people in order for them to oppose. The common denominator, as usual, is a hatred of the one true God. Let's go ahead and head to the Chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
All right, Chaplain's Report today, as I'm sure most of you could have predicted, is going to revolve around similar things that we've been talking about today already. And it's going to be primarily on this one passage from Colossians. And it talks about how Paul dealt with Christians arguing, because as you remember at the top of the show, one of the things that we were discussing is this sort of rift between the dispensationalist and the replacement theologist on within the realm of Protestantism. And so I thought it might be useful to talk about a passage that specifically deals with Christians while they were arguing with one another. And Paul does this masterfully in the book of Colossians chapter 2, verses 8 through 12. So we see here, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ. For in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, and in him you have all been made complete, and he is the head over all rule and authority. And in him you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, in the removal of the body of flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. Now, in this particular passage, what we see is a start with a simple warning. And it's very eloquent, as Paul usually is, but it really all boils down to one thing. Remember who's in charge. Don't be caught up by the philosophy of men or empty deception or the traditions of men or any of that stuff. God's the one in charge. Listen to him. Don't listen to men. When you boil it down, that's really all that warning is saying. Remember who you answer to. It's not men. You don't have to please them. You don't have to work. They're not going to be able to have any say whatsoever in your eternal destination. If you want to actually talk and argue about the things that matter, you ultimately have to remember that God is in charge and he's the one that decides these things. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't times where we shouldn't argue, where we shouldn't hash things out and discuss them. I wouldn't be a professional arguer if I didn't believe that that had value. But what it does say is, if you're going to be arguing about something, make sure it's over something that God actually cares about. If you're going to harm your relationship, or at least potentially harm your relationship with a brother, make sure that the reason he's upset with you is because you preach the truth of God's word, not because of your personal preference, or a preacher or a rabbi in their case that you really, really like, and you want to say that one's better than the one that he likes or something like that. Ultimately, God's the one that is in charge. And so don't go out following vain philosophies or empty deceits or anything like that. Ultimately, what you need to do is be constantly focused on pleasing God and doing things that are pleasing in his sight. If you are arguing about something that has to do with that, that's okay. But don't get caught up in these endless arguments about things that are ultimately a matter of opinion. That's what Paul is talking about. So ultimately, you follow God, not the elementary principles of the world or other men. And it also establishes why Jesus Christ is the correct answer. So, as Paul typically does, he gives a command and then he gives an explanation for the command. So, you've got the original rationale, be worried about the things that God's worried about, and then he gives the reason why. So, if you'll look in that verse, you'll notice that what he's actually talking about there is that you took a vow, you made a promise when you became a follower of Christ. You sealed that promise with the baptism. You took that vow to be his. You were buried with him and you rose up in newness of life as a new person, and you have to live that out. You have to live as though you really are a new creature. And so because you took those vows, did you take those vows to Paul? No. Did you take those vows to Apollos? No. Did you take those vows to your local elder or deacon that you like? No. Did you take those vows to your minister? No. You took those vows to Christ. And so he's the only one that gets to dictate the terms of that covenant. When you gave your life over to him, you forfeited your own life. And now he's the one that gets to dictate those things to you. And so because of that, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to spend all of your time arguing about which philosophy, which is rooted in something a guy thought up, is actually the correct one. So if we were to go back and apply that to the discussion we were having at the beginning, if we're talking about replacement theology or dispensational theology, does it make a lot of sense to argue about which preacher is preaching those things correctly? No. Does it make an awful lot of sense to figure out which one of those theologies is true or not? Yeah, that matters a lot. And so ultimately, just don't get caught up in the side arguments. Focus on the main thing and actually pleasing God and figuring out what is right according to God's word and God's dictates, not those of mankind. You see, your only hope for this life is to share in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And so let's go on and look at another verse here that is directly after the ones that we just finished reading in Colossians 2, verses 13 through 15, as Paul wraps this idea up. He says, when you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. So when we're talking about our relationship to the old law, again, as I said, I view it as scaffolding. It is something that Paul refers to as a tutor, something that we can learn from. But we're no longer under that, and that verse explains why. When Christ went to the cross, the old law was nailed to it with him. All the edicts and things that showed why we were unrighteous and unworthy of God's salvation and mercy, all of which is true, by the way. There's not a part of that that is in any way untrue. But when Christ died on the cross, he nailed it to that cross so that it can no longer be used against us. You see, it's not because we were able to adhere to the law better than we did before. It's that even through that frailty and through that inadequacy, that it doesn't matter anymore because Jesus died for us. That's ultimately the point of what Jesus is saying there through the pen of Paul, is that because Jesus took that for us, he died in our place to forgive us of our sins. That's ultimately the reason he gets to tell us what to do now. He bought us at a very high price. And because of that, that edict that said that we don't belong to him, that we are incapable of salvation, that we have sinned, we have gone against God, and because of that, there is no hope for us of salvation or living eternally with him, all of it was true. And it was all nailed to the cross with Jesus Christ. His death is the only reason we get to forego that. And that's why I say the old law is not done away with or replaced. It's still there. It's just been fulfilled through the promise of Christ. The old law wasn't done away with. It was just nailed to the cross so that through his death, it no longer can be used against us. It wasn't abolished. And Jesus really died to free us of that old law, which was impossible for us to uphold. And the Jews get that same covenant. In the same way that we are afforded the blessing of no longer being under the old law, the Jews get the same deal. They have the ability to have their sins and the edicts that were written against them nailed to the cross just like we do. They don't have any special status in the kingdom, but they also have the same opportunity afforded to us that we have right now. And so because of that, they are able to share in the Abrahamic covenant just like we are. You see, they're getting a better covenant too. And ultimately, that's the idea that is being presented here, that Paul uses that sort of symbolism we see in verse 15. You remember, if you were to go back to it real quick, and we'll just look at it again real quickly, you'll see at the end there, he says he disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. So what is that talking about? Well, in the olden days, back when this was being written, one of the things that a king would do when he conquered a people is he would take the captives and he would parade them through the city on a victory tour. So like your king goes away for a little while, he conquers the people, he brings back the prisoners, and part of his return parade, which would celebrate his victory over his enemies, is that he would make a public display of those he conquered. He would actually parade the captives through the streets to show, this is my might, this is my power, see how powerless they are. They were powerless against me. I conquered them. I took them out of commission. They have no power over you anymore. Your enemies no longer have any threat to you whatsoever because of my power, because of what I did for you. That's what the king was essentially saying by parading them through the streets. He's saying, my people no longer have to worry about these people because I conquered them. And that's exactly what is going on here. The old law, it had a stake against us because it showed how unrighteous we were. It showed that we were doomed to die in our sins because there was no way for us to overcome them. Doesn't matter, because the king came and he conquered it. Therefore, he has put them in public display as a glory, as a thing to show off, saying that this is what has been done. These are the people that were lost in their sin, and now I have put that sin, I have put their enemies under captivity and subjugation because of my glory and because of my ability to do that. So ultimately, that's the sort of symbolism that he is drawing on. So Jesus, he did die. So both Gentiles and Jews no longer had to deal with that anymore. They didn't have to be subject to the law and didn't have to be subject to the death that followed the inability to follow that law. And that's not something we should shy away from. That's something we should rejoice in. So no longer is the sin and the things that we're having to deal with something to be ashamed of, but ultimately it's something we can brag about because Jesus put those things under his subjection. He has nailed those edicts to the cross, and he has made them a public display. So that even the evil things that we did in our previous life are something that can glorify him in the same way that Paul knew that very well. Remember that Paul was a murderer that put Christians to death just for proclaiming the name of Christ. And he became one of his greatest advocates. He's the person writing the passage that we're reading right there. And so ultimately, those are no longer things for us to be ashamed of, but things that we can hold out to other people and say, look how powerful my God is. He took all of these things wrong in my life. He took these laws that said correctly that I was guilty of sin and deserving of death. And he put those under his subjugation because he loved me so much. And so when we look at these doctrinal differences and these issues that we have, ultimately, as long as they are something that is genuinely something that God cares about, they are something that, maybe even we were wrong on. Everything has been put in subjugation under him, because ultimately the thing that we're supposed to take away from that is that he ultimately is our king, and we should subject ourselves to him, not to the traditions or sayings of men, because he is the one that conquered sin and death for us. Stay the course, friends.
Thank you for listening to the Tactics Podcast. Tactics is a production of Not Ashamed Media. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of our business partners or sponsors. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by Del Reyta Church of Christ. Copyright 2021.